Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest. A very big welcome to today's episode, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Melanie Wilkey. Melanie is the Deputy Director of Commissioning at Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, and she brings a wealth of expertise in healthcare and leadership. She has a background in innovation and commissioning, partnership working, emergency planning, and project management. And Melanie is a true leader in her field. She excels in change management, business process development, and re engineering, making her a really invaluable resource for anyone looking to navigate the complexities of the healthcare sector. Melanie also has a research interest in imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, which is something that I learned from Melanie. So join us as we explore her insights and experiences and really looking at that critical element of effective leadership and strategic healthcare management. Melanie, it's wonderful to have you here.
It's lovely to be here. And thank you for the very impressive intro. It makes you sound so interesting, doesn't it, when someone reads out your accomplishments?
Well, you are interesting, and you're so interesting that we're actually coming back to do this twice. So, listeners and watchers, what you won't know is that Melanie and I have recorded this already about 18 months, nearly
Oh,
2 years
probably.
ago.
Yeah.
And we discovered that the sound quality was really poor. Think bottom of a well, tin shed. It was really poor, and nothing we could do was able to fix it. And it's taken us this long to get back together. But it was such a brilliant conversation. I really wanted to come back together with Mel so that you could hear what she had to say. So, Mel, tell us, how do you define self awareness and what are your thoughts on its relevance to leadership in the healthcare sector, particularly?
I think it's a really interesting lens to look at leadership through, in that being self-aware. As a leader within an organization, you need to be aware of the organizational context that you're working in, but also how are you within that context. So how do your peers see you? How does your line manager see you? I work in a partnership arena. How are you coming across to partners? And all of these things are really important. If you're leading a team of people, what do they need from you? What do they think of you? And how do you support them and develop them in the right way? Healthcare becomes increasingly more complex by the year as there's new innovations, how we deliver healthcare, what we expect from individuals in terms of looking after their own health, and how then that transforms into what we deliver on the ground, what people are entitled to expect. And also there's raising expectations of what people can receive from the NHS, and when they can have it and how they can access it. You know, we live in a 24/7 world that in some ways was probably increased during the pandemic. So much easier now at a touch of a button to get what you want when you want. You can work where you want in a lot of organizations. And so I'm getting on in years now, in the later half of my career probably, but how I operate has changed significantly in the 30 years since I first became a manager. And being able to lead and manage in new and changing environments all the time means that you have to maintain a level of self-awareness. So who are you within that system? What's this system to you? And how do you take meaning from the work that you do? I think it's really important to bring some of yourself to work. And I think previously, when I was young, maybe we'll come on to this a little bit in some of the later questions, leaders were very often men and quite autocratic in style. And as a woman, if you wanted to succeed in that environment, you had to mimic some of those behaviors. And as work has changed and younger people have come into the workplace, all of those sorts of expectations about what a leader is and how a leader can support individuals and an organization to achieve its goals have changed seismically, really. And so without a level of self-awareness as to how you fit in that within that system, you would very quickly become yesterday's news and somebody who doesn't fit into a modern world. So that real sense of self-awareness helps you to maintain a presence, I think, within both your team and within the wider organization.
It's interesting that you're talking about that change, and it's something that I really have noticed in the world of work is that when I first started in the world of work, you didn't really go and talk to senior people. They were unobtainable, they were inaccessible, and really you shouldn't go and approach a senior person. But now that really has changed, and people are far more approachable, and they're transparent, and they're open, and they welcome that kind of communication. But absolutely, unless you are wise to that change, you are going to miss out on that opportunity, and probably you're going to be shipped out into a different role or a different organization even before you blink. So yeah, that change is really, as you say, it's like the seismic shift.
We always used to call it special projects in a previous organization. If someone was going on a special project, it was like, oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
So if
And
anyone ever comes to me and says, well, we've got a special project for you, I'm like that. Oh, no.
yes, and in the NHS we used to joke and say that people were promoted out of harm's way, so that they couldn't line manage anybody, and they can be an advisor that were just out of the way, and you could make the decision as to whether you wanted to take their advice or not. So yeah, those days are definitely changing. But what experience have you had of working with people where they didn't have high self-awareness, or maybe they had low self-awareness, and they had that light bulb moment? What's your experience of different kind of people with it and without it?
I think it's one of those difficult things, because if people aren't self-aware, they don't know it. And so, quite often those are people who maybe rise to a certain level because they're very good at talking the talk. They're very good at sort of what I was just describing, that kind of mimicry of what they see above them, without really developing their own style and their own way of really taking that leadership forward. And I've worked in organizations where people just haven't really been aware that people don't like them and don't like working for them. And it makes it a very difficult place to be then, because you almost get a bit of siege mentality, don't you, within a team? So if you've got a manager who's exhibiting behaviors that are not in line with an organization's values and not chiming with your own personal values, it's really difficult to kind of settle into that sort of role. And so everybody sort of bands together and it's everybody against the leader.
Yeah.
But then they sort of double down on those behaviors. So it's like, actually, I told you what to do and you didn't do it. So I'm going to tell you again, and I'm going to do it in a more and more punitive way until you do what I want, how I want you to do it. And it's a really old-fashioned way of working, I think, that, and I've seen it have terrible effects on teams. And good people leave because they can, because they're really competent, they're really capable. They'll look for their next opportunity. They might go sooner than they were going to go, but they'll be looking for that foot out of the door, and people will always have that foot out of the door. And that's not good for the team, because you sense that people are on the edge all the time. And then as people leave and new people come in, you never have any sort of stability, and you're not building that real sense of team and how can we work together, how can we really make a change together? Because for me, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. And with some of those individuals who aren't self-aware, we like to recruit in our own image, don't we? Because a traditional interview style, it's very much conversational. So you're recruiting people then that you build a rapport with. If people are fairly even on qualifications, when you're coming down to those decisions between people who may be equally able to do the job, you're picking people who are like you, because as human beings, we like that, don't we? We like that sense of being. Yeah. But what that does then is it creates you an echo chamber, because people with the same values as you, so you don't get any feedback from a different perspective. People say, actually, that might be how we've always done it, but can we do it a different way? We've got different technologies, take a different lens at it. Didn't really work. We've got a slog to get this done. There might be a better way of doing this that's driving efficiencies for us, both as individuals or as a wider team. And I think that there's definitely something for me in recruitment and retention, and how we think about that in a different way, because we're quite wedded to these models of panel interviews, and you might get a stakeholder panel where a slightly different group of people might ask you some slightly different questions. But it's the same thing. It's the can you perform on the day? And it's the same people who did well at exams. It's can you turn it on when you need to turn it on? And not everybody can. And actually, some of the best people I've ever worked with have been people that are terrible at interviews because they like to sit back and they like to reflect. And the nature of being questions being fired at you is you don't have that time to reflect. And it makes it really difficult. And those potentially then are the more self-aware people because they're thinking about how do I put myself across in the context of this question that you've asked me? I want to show myself in the best light. How do I do that? Rather than actually, I'm quite good at interviews. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this shiny version of myself. And here's the sell. Here's the big sell. And I think it's been a bit of a revelation for me, really, because going back to what I was saying before about when I first came into managerial roles, the female leaders that I saw tended to be, suited and booted, quite autocratic in style, very put together in every sense of the word, both like physically in terms of their appearance, but also in terms of really specific and driven. And in seeing that and thinking, well, actually, I would like to be a leader in an organization like this, you start to, well, when I was young, quite consciously model those sorts of behaviors. But as you get older, perhaps slightly less consciously model those sorts of behaviors in order to fit or in order to be seen to be the type of person that might be able to be a leader within this organization. At one point, you do these kind of Belbin or MBTI type assessments of what's the team and who fits where. And we'd done one of these sorts of, not either of those, but something of that sort of ilk for the whole team. And you get these are your strengths, and these are the things that how people need to interact with you, and these sorts of things. And one of the kind of you always focus on the negative things, don't you? But one of the things in these are the potential negatives about how you filled in this questionnaire is it was something like, somebody needs to issue Melanie's team with flak jackets. And I was like, well, that's not the person that I want to be. And I was like, have I answered this kind of questionnaire that I've had to do? Have I answered it as myself, or have I answered it as the person that I want other people to see? Because I think that's how I should behave if I want to be a leader. And it was an awakening for me because I was like, actually, I don't want to be seen like that. So I'm going to bring a bit more of me to it. I'm going to try and be a bit less manager and a bit more Mel.
That's a lovely way of describing it. As you were talking, I'm reminded that I worked with a fairly senior colleague in an organization, and he had to work with colleagues in another organization. And he would often say, there is something very peculiar about the senior leadership in that organization. Each one of them that he was coming across were very devoid of emotion. It was all about getting the job done. They were not interested in feedback. They were not interested in any kind of nuances or implementation challenges. And he would regularly say that there is something peculiar about these people. And I do wonder whether the more senior people in that organization, were they recruiting in their likeness? Did they have any idea that people really didn't like working with them? And it's something we often talk about on this podcast, is about recruitment has got a lot to answer for. But I've yet to find anybody who has got a revolutionary way to recruit. I mean, how else can we do it? Some people talk about more of an interview. The chief exec of Olio, she talked about interviewing people to talk about mission obsession. But again, it's that same, you come to a panel, you have a conversation, you do a presentation or you do an audition. I've yet to come across anybody who's doing it wildly different to that. So, but if there are listeners and watchers and you are doing something really different, please let us know, because I think it's about time all of us try to really think about our recruitment processes.
Yeah. And, this is something that's coming a little bit out of these kind of early emerging themes out of my research, which is that how can we do things differently, and trying to get people to say, well, what could we do differently? And we're not very good anymore at taking references, are we? Because of the subjective nature of giving an opinion on somebody. Certainly within our organization, a reference is very much, yes, they worked here from this date to that date, they did these roles, rather than really being able to express an opinion on whether you think they're suitable for the role that they've given you as a reference for. And so is there something about almost turning it on its head, in that you do take a reference early on, an application form, if we can check that the assertions made are correct? Arguably, you could say that from an application form, you can generally tell if somebody could do the job. Have they got the right qualifications? Have they got the right experience? Have they got the right sort of skills? And people can spend some time doing that. But obviously, when you're writing things down, there's an element of, well, you can embellish the truth a little bit. So part of the point of the interview, isn't it, is to tease some of that out. But then some of my participants are saying, well, actually, if you think that they could do the job for the application, why don't you invite them and come and spend a day with the team? And actually, what we'll do is the business of the team. But then that means that recruitment process then is protracted, because you have to give those shortlisted candidates then equal opportunity to have time with the team and experience those different sorts of things. Because certainly in the partnership space, where people and relationships are actually more important sometimes than the content, who it is and how they work within the team can be more important than what they know and what they've done in the past. And so there's possibly something in there around how can we do some more context heavy elements to a recruitment sort of process. But yeah, it does make it expensive. If you're recruiting entry level jobs, you can't bring everybody in and spend a day with the team. But certainly for senior jobs where there are fewer individuals in the candidate pool, that fit is much more important, and the impact that they have on the team, on the organization, is higher because they have more control. They have a bigger span of control. They have a bigger span of influence. So the cost to the organization, both kind of financially if they don't stay, but also in terms of productivity and well-being and all of those sorts of things, can be really high for an organization if you recruit the wrong person at a senior level.
Yes, I was talking to Turab on my podcast a couple of episodes ago, and he was talking about giving people opportunities to shine. So it might be a particular exercise, or it might be a part of a test as part of an interview. But his feedback was that people were saying, well, if you want me to work for you, you need to pay for my time. So again, it's that I'd love somebody to come and spend a day with the team to see whether they fit us, we fit them. But again, how do you reconcile that with, are you asking them to come and work for free for the day? How do you then shortlist somebody if you've got 24 people and you want to bring them down to a short list of 5? How do you do that with it doesn't become a long and protracted process? So yeah, I think there are some interesting things that we need to talk about in terms of recruitment. If anybody's got some wonderful ideas, please do share them with us. When we last met, we talked about leadership at all levels, and this is something that I'm quite interested in. You've worked in a number of organizations and in different areas. What's your experience of people at different levels of organizational hierarchy demonstrating those leadership qualities? And maybe this is something that's come out as part of your imposter phenomenon research. What are you seeing in terms of those different levels?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people see a job title as being indicative of whether they're a leader. And for me, that's not the case. Just because you're manager, director, deputy director, whatever your job title is, it doesn't make you a leader. And giving people the opportunity to lead in their area of expertise is really important. The area of work that I kind of look after is quite small within our organizations. Within the team, there's 11, 12 of us in the team. Everybody's got their own particular specialty, so we don't all do the same thing. So I haven't got the bandwidth to know the detail of everybody's job. And so I look to the other people in the team to offer leadership within their functions. And I would always look to them for expertise and advice. And they're definitely the subject matter experts. But in doing that, in looking to that, then you're opening up for innovation, aren't you? Because I don't know how to innovate in every area that's part of my responsibility. I know things that work. I know things that worked in the past. I've got an eye on the horizon. I'm looking at what works elsewhere. But actually, true innovation usually doesn't come from the top, because the breadth of what that individual is looking at means that the level of accountability is actually the innovations coming from somebody saying, we could just do that differently. How can we start to turn the curve? How can we solve a problem in a different way? So from a commissioning perspective, and it's been a bit of a challenge for me, we've started trying to commission for outcomes. So rather than kind of writing a service specification and putting it out to tender and saying, this is how we want the service to run, these are the key performance indicators, this is how we're going to measure your performance, we're starting to look at, well, actually, it doesn't matter what you deliver, how you deliver it. What matters is whether you can make the change for the population that we're seeking. Then you're kind of handing that opportunity to innovate out to the third sector. They're closer probably to some of our residents and our service users, so they know much better than I do about what's going to work, what's not going to work at a community level. And so allowing that innovation allows that leadership to come up from the different areas and the different aspects of the work. And they're things that I potentially would never have considered, different approaches, different ways of looking at things, different ways of delivery, all of these things. You get stuck in a rut, don't you? This is how we deliver services. We write services here on top of the door. We either open the door and let you come in whenever you want, or we send you a letter telling you when to come through the door. But that's not necessarily the best way. How do we get out? How do we get into communities? How are we making sure that by putting the sign above the door, we're not creating stigma? Because actually, you've got to walk through that door. So if you're walking through that door, then you must be that sort of person. And we've got to take away from that. How are we as individuals able to access healthcare or wider services and those sorts of things? And I think in the pandemic, leadership emerged from lots of different places. And I think this has been seen kind of across the piece, because immediately we were, well, how do we deliver things? So obviously within health, we didn't put people on furlough. We had to think about ways of doing things differently. And while I wasn't particularly involved in things like setting up the Nightingale hospitals and those sorts of things, you hear the reports of how people led from all levels and actually streamline the decision making, and you didn't have to jump through any hoops to get things decided upon, to be able to spend very large sums of money to get things done in a very short period of time. Now, the flip side of that is that's not always the way we can go about it, because at the end of the day, we're spending public money, aren't we? Yeah. So we need to be accountable for that. And so during that time, there was a lighter touch in terms of governance and those sorts of things. So you weren't having to make sure that everybody was on board with the decisions and there was agreement, and this is how we're going to use our resources in the most effective way to deliver the best outcomes for our residents. And so there's a kind of running back from that a little bit, I think, because it's not been able to continue that. But I think that there's definitely some pockets of learning on how people can be left to lead things, that they don't actually have to be reporting back every 5 minutes to say, project's on track, the project's on track, the project's on track. Actually, I'm coming and telling you, I need this, I need that. It's going to fail if we don't. To me, how do we get into these kind of exceptions and let people kind of lead the pieces of work that you've recruited them to do? I think we get it where you've got quite a lot of layers of governance. We get into this space where people have to act down all the time. It's like you're sort of checking the homework of everybody that reports to you, and so you're not operating up here, you're checking the detail down here. But actually, if you devolve that leadership, if you give people permission to act within their delegated authority, then you're starting to see this innovation. You're starting to see new leaders emerging, and you can see new leadership styles coming forward, and it kind of devolves that leadership. So doesn't just sit with single individuals or your board and those sorts of things. So you start to see how the organization can move and change.
I like that, the way that you describe that. And I often talk about cognitive diversity and leadership at all levels, but I don't suppose I've really thought about them, that actually, if you accept that you have leadership at all levels, you do create those opportunities for people where there is cognitive diversity to rise up, and it does generate that innovation. So I don't know. I feel a model coming on there. I feel like I need to draw some circles and some lines. Absolutely, there is that connection.
Unlock your potential with expert career coaching. Sarah Breyer, seasoned recruiter and career coach, is here to guide you every step of the way. Whether you're aiming higher in your current field or changing careers, Sarah helps you stand out with a polished CV, nail interviews with tailored prep, and gain the confidence you need to land the job you deserve. Specializing in helping introverted professionals and those feeling stuck, Sarah's coaching is all about strategies that work and confidence that lasts. Start today and let Sarah illuminate your career journey.
If you are looking for a job, Sarah Breyer is here to help. From crafting a CV that grabs attention to personalized interview prep, she'll make sure you stand out from the crowd.
Head to sarahbreyer.co.uk for more information.
Tell us what imposter syndrome is, or imposter phenomenon. And there are academic definitions and there are socially understood definitions. But from your research perspective, tell us what imposter phenomenon is.
Yeah, so in the lay literature, you will see it written down as imposter syndrome. You put imposter syndrome into Google and you'll get, 10 million results or something like that. And you'll see rafts of self-help books that are overcoming imposter syndrome, these sorts of titles. But in the academic literature, it's called the imposter phenomenon. And it's called the imposter phenomenon because the psychologists that first kind of coined the term, Clance and Imes, in the late 1970s, they felt that by calling it a syndrome, they implied that it was pathological in origin, that it is something in you. But calling it a phenomenon is that combination of it's nature, it's nurture, it's sociology, it's how we bring up children. The original research in the 70s specifically looked at women and how women are in the workplace, so high achieving women in the 70s, people who have very objectively achieved success in their field, feeling like they don't deserve it and that they're going to be found out. And it's these sorts of words that kind of pervade through the academic literature. It's this fear of being found out. It's the not being good enough. It's the I'm here by luck or because of the forbearance of others. Somebody else has helped me along the way. It's not me. And while early research was centered around women, later research has shown that it's actually quite equally experienced by men and women. And that at some point in our lives, 70% of us will experience what has been described as imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. And so we don't really talk about it at a leadership level because, and it goes back to some of these kind of quite old-fashioned things. You come into a new role and how do you say, oh, I'm not really sure I know how to do it. Thanks for giving me this job, but and am I the right person? And that all kind of sets in. So people are much more likely to experience imposter phenomenon at times of change. Yeah. So from a leadership perspective, that getting a new job is a key part of that, whether that's an internal promotion, whether it's sideways into a new project, whether it's being recruited into a new organization. It's that feeling that actually you don't know what you're doing and somebody's going to find out. And it can have all sorts of impacts on you as an individual then, because people will respond to those feelings, those imposter feelings, in a lot of different ways. So people might look to be a perfectionist. So actually, what do they say? Perfection is the enemy of done. Rather than saying, actually, this is the time I've got to give to this task. I've done the best I can do. actually it's putting in extra work, making sure that it's perfect. So going over and above, which can then contribute to this sense of out that people get. And that's not good for an organization, because if people are burnt out, then they're having time off sick, they're potentially not working in a team as effectively as they could, they're not being as open in that team. But other people then go to the opposite extreme, they procrastinate. So procrastination is a kind of, recognized response to it. So actually, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it well enough, so I'm just not going to start.
Okay. Tell us about your research then. So it's all about imposter phenomenon.
Yeah.
What is your research specifically looking at, and what are you already starting to see? Because you've mentioned one element already. What else are you starting to see?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in it in a workplace situation. So, and in that leadership and management space, because it's always been really important to me to be seen as being credible in the job that I do. And that means bringing knowledge and expertise, but then also that listening and that self-awareness and being able to develop within whatever role that it is. But when you start in that job, on day one, you feel like you're not credible. So as leaders, how then do we start to think about imposter phenomenon in a different sort of way? Because the higher up an organization you get, the more senior you get, the fewer peers that you have. And so we talked earlier about having a toxic manager. You get this siege mentality, all of you together. But if you're the leader, then suddenly it's a very lonely place to be, and they're paying you the big bucks. So they've recruited you, you've got the job, you've got the salary, you've got the title, all of those sorts of things. You're going to come in and say, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah. And how do we start to, as workplaces and workplace culture, say, that's okay? When you start in this organization, you don't know, regardless of whether you are first level healthcare support or whether you're the chief executive, you don't know exactly what this job needs of you on the first day. And how do we say that's okay? And everybody here is here to support you, to make you the best that you could possibly be in order to deliver that role that we think you're the best person for. And so for me, my research is about, so what does it feel as a leader, as a really senior leader, to feel imposter syndrome when people around you look at you and think, well, look at them, they've got the job, they're great, they're amazing, they're confident. But how do we then say, actually, it's okay even as a leader to be able to say, I don't know, at the beginning, without losing this level of credibility? Because what you can't come in and say, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to do some terrible citation now because I can't actually remember who wrote the piece. But there's an article in the Harvard Business Review, and it's called something like the authenticity paradox. So you want to bring a piece of yourself to work, don't you? You want to bring yourself, you want to be authentic to yourself, because if you can't work with passion, particularly in the industry that I work in, why are you here? Because you're here to make a difference to individuals. So you bring in that piece of yourself. But if you're saying, actually, to the extent I don't know what I'm doing, you're going to have to help me, and really I really don't know what I'm doing, then actually people don't trust you as a leader. So there's a balance in there to saying, I'm learning, and I know I'm learning, and I know I've got a lot to learn, but I'm bringing all of these things as well. So you can trust me. I am trustworthy, but being open about the fact that you don't know everything, and you're not coming in as the finished article of what you will be in that role once you understand the organization and the whole ask, which you'll never get from any recruitment process, regardless of how good it is. Until you're actually doing it, you don't know really what it entails. So I am doing some, quite soft quants, really, real conversational kind of interview techniques, because what I found when I was doing some of the modules, so I'm doing a DBA rather than a PhD, so we did some modular work before we went into our independent research phase, was if I read the literature and I write the semi-structured interview questions, I've derived a theoretical framework from my literature review. I'm almost preempting what I think the answer is going to be, because I'm structuring the interviews based on my own kind of experience. So what I've started to do now is take a much more conversational approach. So go with a little bit of open book, a little bit of introduction about imposter phenomenon and what it is and why I'm interested in it, but then really open it up into a conversation, talking about some of my own personal experiences of imposter phenomenon and smattering it with some of the literature and the evidence that supports it, in order to be able to really see what other people think about it, not just how I'm already interpreting it. So as a qualitative researcher, it's really important to understand your own role within the research, because it's your lens that brings the research philosophy to life, isn't it? So for me, then it's about really doing that reflexive piece. So how am I reflecting? So I start to reflect after I do each of these kind of conversational interviews that almost brings an autoethnography to it. And I think that I'm not anywhere near writing it, but that's the kind of emerging kind of methodology that's starting to come to the fore for me now. And I think what I'm finding from my early participants is it is everybody I've talked to at this sort of level. In healthcare, arguably, I probably see more self-aware leaders than I've seen in the private sector before. So I would say that I see it more, but then it might be observational bias, isn't it? I'm looking for it now and I'm asking people about it. So perhaps it's just more obvious to me. So take that into account as well. And people are really open about their experiences if you ask them. So they won't tell you, but if you ask them, they're really open at every sort of level. And this sense of feeling isolated and feeling alone. And if 70% of us feel it, why should we feel so isolated about it? So how can we make it less isolating for people? Is there something, as well as the recruitment, is there something about the onboarding that says, actually, here's a mentor or here's a peer buddy who is going to just be your sounding board and to be able to say, I don't know how to do this. Who does this? Who does that? You don't know when you first start in an organization, you don't know who does what. You don't know where HR sit. You don't know where IT is. My computer doesn't work. And just some of those things that you think, oh my God, I should know how to get these basic everyday kind of managerial tasks done. I don't know how to get them done. Being able to support you through some of the nuts and bolts so that you're able to focus on, actually, this is the job at hand. And sometimes having a peer group is really helpful, and people are reflecting that, where they've got really strong peer groups, a safe space where people feel psychologically safe, be able to say, actually, can you help me? Have any of you seen this before? It is really helpful for people when they're starting these new roles. So there's definitely something about that onboarding for me, and then that kind of ongoing support, particularly then where people move and change internally within an organization where it's not such a formal onboarding sort of process. Yeah. But yeah, so those are my initial kind of emerging thoughts, but I need to structure it into something a bit more meaningful, and I'm sure there'll be a model than a diagram.
Definitely. That is fascinating, and I think there's a lot about culture, absolutely, psychological safety, there's humility, vulnerability, confidence, trust. All of those things fit into what you've been talking about, and again, recruitment and onboarding, and how do we set the culture from the word go that it's okay for you not to have to know everything the minute you step through the door. And that'll be really interesting to see what your final findings are going to be. I've got this idea that as people become more self-aware, they realize how much they don't know. And I wonder if self-awareness and increased self-awareness, does it exacerbate imposter syndrome? Does it create it? And what about that whole cycle? What are your thoughts? And I asked that on the basis that interestingly, I've spoken to Aoife O'Brien and Adrian Ashton, who also have interest in imposter syndrome. So listeners and watchers, if you've got an interest, we've got 3 podcast guests who can talk about imposter syndrome. So Mel, where do you stand on that idea of increased self-awareness, increase imposter syndrome?
Definitely. It's your Johari window, isn't it? You get into your known unknowns, don't you? I know what I don't know. And it's like doing the doctorate as well, isn't it? The more you read, the more you realise you really don't have a clue about the topic at all. We went to a session quite recently. I'm on a development programme, and somebody came to talk about imposter syndrome. And in the break, one of my peers said, "Oh, here's Mel, she's the expert." And I was like, "I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert." And I was like, I've read so much about it. If I'm not an expert, who is? And there's a little bit of that, but I know how much I don't know in doing that. So there's definitely an element of that, because I think that if you are a self-aware person and you do reflect and you do kind of think about, well, if I did that again, how would I do it differently? You're always going to find a way of thinking that you could do it differently, or you could do it better. And so in that, there is the space for, well, I didn't do it well enough in the first place, so maybe I shouldn't be doing this job. Or look at such and such over there, they look to have done it with ease. And you don't know that they're not imposter syndrome with perfectionism, and they've spent hours and hours of their own time getting it across the line to make it look easy. And it's all of these things about, you don't know what goes on for other people. And so that self-awareness of, I don't know these things, absolutely, it's going to underpin that sense of feeling impostery, and I'm going to get found out. And there's that just niggling fear, I think, then, that it gives you a tension that creates a stress in you, that if it endures, if you're not supported to move past the things that are causing the imposter syndrome, that actually then that is building, and it is causing that burnout and the stress that's, unnecessarily so. In complex work environments that most of us work in now, stress is an inevitability because of the pace, because of the changing nature of that complex system. What worked last time won't necessarily work this time, because you've got different people, different situation, different circumstances. And so it's that adaptability, so that, well, I don't know how to adapt to this new environment. And that self-awareness of that not knowing starts to build this sense of being an imposter. And there are elements of personality to this. While I was saying it's experienced equally by men and women deal with it differently. And it's around, some of it's around personality. Extroverts tend to be a little bit more of the feel the fear and do it anyway. You hear people saying it. Entrepreneurs will always say that. I didn't fit in around the table and I felt like an imposter, so I just showed what I could do. But introverts then need that time to reflect, and they can't bring themselves to do the feel the fear and do it anyway. And so it kind of embeds some of these senses of being an imposter, and being that you might be found out as not being good enough, and being a little bit neurotic, which is in a psychological sense rather than a pejorative sense, but which is more often associated with women. So are you taking these things on board? So perhaps for all of us, things don't go as well as you hope they would every single time. Nobody's that successful. And you actually learn more from failure anyway. Yeah. But it's that, how can you take that failure as a learning rather than as a personal, actually, I'm not good enough, but rather than, actually, I can learn from that and I can be better. So it's that, rather than taking it on board as a personal criticism or shortcoming, how do you start to think, actually, I could build on this as a strength? And those are really difficult things to do if you're introverted, if you're a little bit neurotic, if you already a little bit anxious. These can all start to build this sense of being an imposter.
For something that we can leave people with, if they are feeling an sense of imposter syndrome now, they are feeling unconfident, they're very concerned that somebody's going to find them out tomorrow, what advice would you give them right now? What's something practical and achievable that they can do to support themselves?
Talk to somebody. It's as simple as that. And you can feel really alone. And it doesn't have to be somebody in your team. It doesn't have to be your line manager, because it could be working in a toxic environment and your line manager's not the right sort of person. But somebody you've had a connection with within the organization, just say, I'm not feeling very confident about this. I might need some help with it. If you've had negative feedback from somebody who knows them well, who seems to be in their sphere, that you can say, actually, what's the best way of approaching this person? How do they like to be worked with? And taking a bit of knowledge from somebody else, but being open and saying, I don't feel very confident about this. I haven't been successful in the past, and so I want to do it better this time. And take a real learning lens to it. So it's try and take it as a learning rather than a personal failing. And that's really difficult if that's your personality. We've talked already about how you're brought up and those sorts of things impacting on how you operate in these sorts of environments. So these can be very entrenched behaviors about keeping it to yourself that are very difficult to overcome. But yeah, if you've got somebody that you trust, have a conversation. They don't even have to be in the workplace. Just talk to somebody who knows you and likes you, and they will be able to tell you about what's positive about you and how you can build on some of those positive characteristics in order to be able to start to build on it. And there's something for us as organizations, I think, to understand that people feel like that. And it doesn't mean that they're not good at their job because they are feeling like an imposter. So how do we create that culture and create that environment? So I suppose my takeaway for leaders and managers is to check in with your teams on one-to-ones. When you're giving somebody a task that's new, if you think it's within their remit and within their skills and their job description, just check in and make sure that they're confident to do it, and make sure they know where to find the resources if it's something new, and provide that kind of just almost like a bit of a safety net for somebody, and letting people fail and really understanding that it's okay to fail, because that's where innovation is, isn't it? If you try something that doesn't work, try something else. And not the same thing will work for everybody. So there's a lot of self-help things about imposter syndrome. So you can find something that works for you. There's people are putting neuroscience to it. This is how you can rework the chains in your brain. But that's not necessarily what everybody wants to do. They don't want to be working on their neuroplasticity and these sorts of things. They want practical things that can help them. And there are a lot of tools and resources that will help with some of those things. But yeah, other people, both supporting people and asking other people for support. For me, leadership's all about people and relationships, and it's relying on yours.
Yeah, so find your champions, have that initial conversation. And I think your advice about it's not about whether you're capable of the role, it's more about the fact that you simply don't know right now and you want to build those skills. And I think that's a really helpful way of framing it. So Mel, you've mentioned that you're in the middle of your research. What is next for your research?
So, I want to get my thesis done is where I want to go next. So what I would like to come out of it, because obviously this is a DBA, so I need some recommendations for practice. Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful that what will come out of this will be some real practical applications for organizations and leaders and managers within organizations, so that we can make it much more open conversation and some real practical suggestions, if you like, for things that we can do, like mentoring or buddying, or how we might change onboarding, or without seismic change in recruitment, how can we make existing types of recruitment practices more comfortable for people who might be feeling a bit like an imposter. So for me, then, I think it's about taking those practical things and how can we embed those within organizations, and kind of socializing those and saying, what do these feel like, and are these things that are practical? Because if they cost a lot of money, nobody's going to do them. So if we can just demonstrate that they add value by just changing how we do things, looking at things through a different lens, then for me, that'll be value in my research.
That's amazing. Listeners, watchers, a DBA is a Doctor of Business Administration. And if you look at my profile and Mel's profile, we both are students of a Doctor of Business Administration. And we both have this idea that our research has to be useful to the world of work. So whether you're looking at imposter syndrome or you're looking at self-aware leadership, we both come from that perspective of being pracademics, I guess. Mel, it's been really great having the conversation with you. I can't wait to find out what your final findings are going to be of your research, and to see your model, and to see your guidebook or your textbook or whatever it ends up being in the end. But Mel, thank you very much for joining me second time around. I really enjoyed the conversation.
It's been great. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.